Granite Shadow. Get player time. Okay, so this article is kind of interesting. This one is Operation Granite Shadow, the U.S. military above top secret plans if COVID-19 cripples the government. As Trump says he tested negative for coronavirus. Yeah, it has been acting a little weird. You're right. It says President Trump says he tested positive for coronavirus, or negative for coronavirus. Not that they would tell us if he tested positive. Let's be real. COVID-19 pandemic raises the fear that huge swaths of executive branch or even Congress and the Supreme Court could also be disabled, forcing the implementation of continuity of government plans that include evacuating Washington and devolving leadership to second-tier officials in remote and quarantined locations. But coronavirus is also new territory where the military itself is vulnerable and the disaster scenarios being contemplated, including the possibility of widespread domestic violence as a result of food shortages, which is not hard to believe at this point. That used to be like, oh, that would never happen, man. You're prepping your food. And we've already seen that happen. Of course, it's been mostly idiots running on toilet paper. But if you go to the store now, it's a limit 2 cans per household. We've seen store hours shut down. And when everybody is trying to get food at the same time, and then you have a disruption in the supply chain of people being able to get that food back to the stores, food shortages could happen quite quickly. Now you add to that some other emergency that strikes, right? We've been having all these crazy earthquakes all over the place, like what happened in Russia today. There was a earthquake off the Russian coast that put Hawaii into a tsunami warning, 7.8 or 7.5 earthquake. And then, there was one in Utah the other day. And then we've been having this weird weather. I could get really tinfoil on you thinking, man, I wonder if we're being, now is a good time to be attacked by the weather warfare gods, because it's a thing. People can do it, even though not many people think that that's a reality. It truly is. But you just add one more emergency, major national emergency to the mix, power outages, communication outages, or even the military and the police getting sick from the coronavirus, right? And having a shortage to be able to patrol. And then we added the fact that we're letting people out of jail because we don't want the poor criminals to get sick all locked up together. So they're getting let out. Low-level crimes or criminals are getting let out, right? And the courts are stressed right now, and some of the courts are not even hearing people. All of a sudden, habeas corpus and your right to be heard before, to defend yourself, and martial law or military law could quite easily become an actual thing. So a breakdown in society. So talking about the food shortages here, that's not something that's too far out of the whack anymore, right? Yeah, exactly. Mark said many police officers are losing officers due to self-quarantine. And Four Nations said if we see continued non-compliance, they'll wind up facing misdemeanor charges, and will step in to shut off their water and power. They very well could. They very well could. And I do want to read an article sent by Rebecca. I don't know if she's still here or not. That something kind of similar to this has already happened, where they actually in Edmonton, they had the mayor just made it illegal to carry any kind of weapon. Gun or anything else. He made a citywide ordinance that you're not allowed to carry a weapon. And then he didn't allow any kind of, public dissent or public discussion or debate on the matter. He just made it a fact. This is it. Deal with it. I'll read you that article in a minute. But anyways, getting back to this one. So it says, result of food shortages, violence, are forcing planners to look at what are called extraordinary circumstances. Above top secret contingency plans already exist for the military, for what the military is supposed to do if all the constitutional successors are incapacitated. Standby orders were issued more than 3 weeks ago to ready these plans, not just to protect Washington, but also to prepare the possibility of some form of martial law. According to new documents and interviews with military experts, the various plans, codenamed Octagon, Freejack, and Zodiac, are the underground laws to ensure government continuity. They are so secret that under these extraordinary plans, devolution could circumvent the normal constitutional provisions for government succession, and military commanders could be placed in control around America. We're in new territory, says one senior officer. The entire post 9/11 paradigm of emergency planning thrown out the window. The officer jokes, in the kind of morbid humor characteristics of this slow-moving disaster, that America had better learn who General Terrence J. O'Shaughnessy is. He is the combatant commander for the United States and would, in theory, be in charge if Washington were eviscerated. That is, until a new civilian leader could be installed. So interesting all this is happening to you right before the elections, right? We're in new territory we've never seen before. What happens, government expert Norman Ornstein asked last week, if so many members of Congress come down with the coronavirus that the legislator cannot meet or cannot muster a quorum. Interesting that we've been having some of our senators and congressmen, I believe, come down with the coronavirus and be quarantined away. Interesting that that's actually happening right now. Interesting that these plans were put in place 3 weeks ago and that now some of this is starting to happen. After 9/11, Ornstein and others, alarmed by how little Washington had prepared for such possibilities, created a bipartisan continuity of government commission to examine precisely these and other possibilities. It has been a two-decade-long futile effort, Ornstein says, with Congress uninterested or unable to either pass new laws or create working procedures that would allow emergency and remote operations. The rest of the federal government equally is unprepared to operate if a pandemic were to hit the very people called upon to lead in an emergency. That is why, for the first time, other planning for the aftermath of a nuclear war, extraordinary procedures are being contemplated. In the past, almost every imagined contingency associated with emergency preparedness has assumed civil and military assistance coming from the outside. One military officer involved in a continuity planning calls it a cavalry mentality. The military assistance is requested or ordered after local civil authority has been exhausted. So again, with officers getting sick, we've heard in the news troops on aircraft carriers and over, in Europe and even here locally in some of our bases have been coming down with the coronavirus. If all of these law officers to keep law and order started to get sick and everything started to devolve, who then is going to step up and manage this? And then there was another article that came out that the Department of Justice and Pentagon was saying that they're running low right now because of people who are sick. So they're kind of in a weakened state. This is all why I get worried about outside other forces, things happening. Anyways, it says, so the military assistance is requested or ordered after civilian authority has been exhausted. There might not be an outside, the officer says, asking that she not be named because she is speaking about sensitive matters. In recognition of equal vulnerability of military forces, the Pentagon has instituted unprecedented restrictions on off-base travel. Last Wednesday, it restricted most overseas travel for 60 days, and then on Friday issued supplemental domestic guidance that essentially keeps all uniformed personnel on or near military bases. There are exceptions, including travel that is mission essential, the Pentagon says. Mission essential in this regard applies to the maze of more than a dozen different secret assignments, most of them falling under three large contingency plans. Con Plan 3400, or the military's plan for homeland defense, if America itself is a battlefield. Con Plan 3500, defense support of civil authorities, where the military assists in an emergency short of armed attack on the nation, which we're seeing right now, right? I think we're in Con Plan 35, defense support of civil authorities. We're seeing National Guard rolled out to help with, giving out of medications and for building makeshift medical places and so on and so forth. They're not, I guess, yet helping the cops, but they're already out on the street and ready to go. And we have seen them, I believe, maybe that was civil authorities in New Jersey, arrest some people who broke the shelter in place. And then Plan 3600, military operations in the National Capital Region and continuation of government, under which the most secret plans to support continuity are nested. All of these plans are the responsibility of U.S. Northern Command, or NORTHCOM, the Homeland Defense military authority created after 9/11. Air Force General O'Shaughnessy is NORTHCOM's Colorado Springs-based commander. On February 1st, Defense Secretary Mark T. Esper signed orders directing NORTHCOM to execute nationwide pandemic plans. Secretly, he signed warning orders, the Warnord, as it's called, alerting NORTHCOM and a host of East Coast units to prepare to deploy in support of potential extraordinary missions. So let me read that again. On February 1st, so before we were even knowing any of this panic was coming, before we knew any of this martial shelter in place, any of that stuff was coming, Mark Esper signed orders directing NORTHCOM to execute nationwide pandemic plans. So they knew this pandemic was coming back in the beginning of February. Secretly, he signed warning orders alerting NORTHCOM and a host of East Coast units to prepare to deploy in support of potential extraordinary missions. 7 secret plans, some highly compartmented, exist to prepare for these extraordinary missions. 3 are transportation related, just to move and support the White House and federal government as it evacuates and operates from alternative sites. The first is called the Rescue and Evacuation of Occupants of the Executive Mansion Plan, or White House, responsible for protecting President Trump, Vice President Mike Pence, and their families. Whether that means moving them at the discretion of the Secret Service or in a catastrophe, digging them out of the rubble of the White House, God forbid. The second is called the Joint Emergency Evacuation Plan, or JEEP, and it organizes transportation for the Secretary of Defense and other national security leaders so that they can leave Washington area. The Atlas Plan is a third, moving non-military leaders, congressional leadership, and Supreme Court and other important figures to their emergency relocation sites. Under Atlas, a still secret bunker would be activated and cordoned, with government operations shifting to Maryland. The 3 most compartmented contingencies, Octagon, Freejack, and Zodiac, call upon various military units in Washington, D.C., North Carolina, and East Maryland to defend government operations if there is a total breakdown. The 7th plan, codenamed Granite Shadow, lays out a playbook for extraordinary domestic missions that involve weapons of mass destruction. I disclosed the existence of this plan in 2005 and its associated National Mission Force, a force that is on alert at all times, even in peacetime, to respond to a terrorist attack or threat with a nuclear weapon. But they later go on to say, or a biological attack. Most of these plans have been quietly activated during presidential inaugurals and State of the Union addresses, and the centrality of the weapons of mass destruction scenario seen in the annual Capitol Shield exercise in Washington. Last year's exercise posited a WMD attack on Metro Station. Military sources say that only the massive destruction caused by a nuclear device or the enormous loss of life that could be caused by a biological agent present catastrophic pressure great enough to justify movement into extra constitutional actions and extraordinary circumstances plans. So see, what that basically is saying is, and I'm not saying we're there yet, but the table is set, and if we all of a sudden, if they wanted to do something like this, they could really push the panic and say, we found out a new virus is coming now, and all the compromised people are going to be dead, and so on and so forth, or we found out this new, or the COVID-19 does this to us, or whatever. The table's set if they want to pull anything super crazy. They are, and this is an exercise right now. It says they are learning so much since this exercise began. Yeah, exactly. This, I haven't read the chat, but they're probably saying this is an exercise. And I think it is. I think ultimately it really is a live world exercise, or they're viewing it as such. We can go back to Event 201 that happened in October in Johns Hopkins University and see how everything laid out in that. If you guys haven't watched Event 201, I suggest you go back and watch it. You're seeing that almost play by play, exactly what in Event 201 said they're rolling out here, almost to the T. It's kind of freaky. Military, most okay, I read all that. Right. Biological agent. Present catastrophic pressure great enough to justify a movement into extra constitutional actions. These kind of things, a weapon of mass destruction or a biological attack, they present catastrophic pressure great enough to justify a movement into extra constitutional actions, which we're starting to see little piece by piece. Not kind of, I guess we're all locked away, which violates our First Amendment of, right of free speech and to gather and go out, right? That's already kind of been taken away. And we've been seeing the soft ban on the Second Amendment, right? And this whole habeas corpus, or the right to speak your piece and to stand up for yourself, that's being it hasn't really been, we haven't seen a lot of that violated yet, but we will. We'll start seeing that when people get restless and go out and start getting arrested and they can't see a judge and they're just held for X amount of time. We'll start seeing that probably happen. WMD is such an important scenario, a former Northcom commander told me, not because it's the greatest risk, but because it stresses the system most severely. Well, of course, yeah. According to another senior retired officer who told me about Granite Shadow and is now working as a defense contractor, the National Mission Force goes out on its missions with special authorities, pre-delegated by the President and the Attorney General. These special authorities are needed because under regulations and the law, federal military forces can supplant civil authority or engage in law enforcement only under the strictest conditions. Well, we're just right on that line like I've been talking about of what could be considered the strictest conditions. When the military emergency authority, when might the military's emergency authority be needed? Traditionally, it's thought of after a nuclear device goes off in America City. But now, planners are looking at military response to urban violence as people seek protection and fight over food. And according to one senior officer, in the contingency of the complete evacuation of Washington. Under Defense Department regulations, military commanders are authorized to take action on their own in extraordinary circumstances where duly constituted local authorities are unable to control the situation. The conditions include large-scale, unexpected civil disturbances involving significant loss of life or wanton destruction of property, which is all just very easily could start to happen. The Joint Chiefs of Staff codified these rules in October 2018. Reminding commanders that they could decide on their own authority to engage temporarily in military control in circumstances where prior authorization by the president is impossible, or where local authorities are unable to control the situation. A new Trump-era Pentagon directive calls it extreme situations. In all cases, even where a military commander declares martial law, the directives say that civil rule has to be restored as soon as possible. In a scenario where a city or one region is devastated, that's a pretty straightforward process, the military planner told me. But with coronavirus, where the effect is nationwide, we're in territory we've never seen before. An extended period of devolution. Continuity of government and protection of the presidency began in the Eisenhower administration, with the possibility emerging that Washington could be obliterated in an atomic attack. The need to plan for a nuclear decision maker to survive even a direct attack led to the building of bunkers and a maze of secret procedures and exceptions, many of which still follow to this day. Congress was also folded in, at least congressional leadership, to ensure that there would always be a constitutional successor, and the Supreme Court was added. Before 9/11, continuity in the emergency programs were broadened beyond nuclear war preparedness, particularly as hurricanes began to have such devastating effects on modern urban society. And because of the advent of pandemics, broadly beginning with the avian influenza, civil agencies responsible for national security, such as the Department of Health and Human Services, which is the lead agency to respond to coronavirus, by the way, were also brought into the continuity protection. Despite well-honed plans and constant testing over 30 years, the attacks on September 11, 2001 severely tested all aspects of the continuity movement and communications. Many of the procedures written down on paper were either ignored or thrown out the window. As a result, continuity had a second coming. Billions spent by the new Department of Homeland and other national security agents to ensure that Washington leadership could communicate and move. A whole new system established to be ready if a terrorist attack came without warning. Bunkers, many shuttered at the end of World War II or World War. Bunkers, many shuttered at the end of the Cold War, were reopened and expanded. Befitting the panic at the time and the atomic legacy, the most extraordinary planning scenarios posited a terrorist attack that would involve an improvised nuclear or radiological dispersal device in a major American city. Which, with all the craziness with, I still, that could even happen. You know, you have the craziness of the different cells and the different ISIS and, jihadi cells that are in America that we know are here and they've been here for a very long time. What if one of those gets activated in this time? Something like that. And not to say it would be a jihadi terrorist necessarily either, that it could be blamed on a jihadi terrorist. I'll just put it that way. Something like that is still, this is where we're not out of the woods yet in my mind, and I'm still a little reserved on if this thing just flows away and we have to deal with fighting back and scratching back our rights that have been taken from us. I'm still kind of curious on how this is all going to pan out, and I'm not convinced everything is just going to go back to normal by Easter or even a month or two after that, and this will be in our rearview mirror. I'm preparing for the worst and hoping for the best. I still think that we could see some other sort of attack on us. Like I've said, whether it be cyber attack, whether it be a dirty bomb, whether it be something, I'm still, I don't know, my spidey senses still are kind of thinking, The terrorist attack scenario dominated until 2006 when the disastrous government response to Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans shifted federal government preparedness to formally adopt an all-hazard system. Civil agencies, the 50 states and local communities, particularly large cities, all began to synchronize emergency preparedness with common protocols. U.S. Northern Command was created to harness military assistance in domestic disasters. Its 3 overarching contingency plans, the product now of 15 years of trial and error. Government at all levels now have extensive continuity programs to respond to man-made and natural disasters, a natural response framework that has steadily grown and taken hold. This is a public world of emergency response, ranging from life-saving efforts to protect and restore critical infrastructure to drills and practice the evacuation of key officials. It is a partnership between federal and government agencies and states, carefully constructed to guard the rule of law. And it's interesting how we've been seeing during this time, President Trump saying the governors have control, right? And the governors saying your local authorities have control. And it all rolls uphill, right? Of ultimately you need to do what they say under penalty of, arrest or of, misdemeanor or of fine, right? In July 2016, Barack Obama signed the classified Presidential Policy Directive 40 on national continuity policy, establishing essential functions the government agencies were tasked to protect and retain. At the highest level were the national essential functions, those that posit the continued functioning of government under the Constitution. In order to preserve constitutional rule, agencies were ordered to have not just a line of succession, but also one of devolution, a duplicate chain of individuals secreted outside Washington and available in a catastrophic emergency. Federal Continuity Directive 1, issued just days before Donald Trump became president, says that the devolution has to establish procedures to transfer statutory authority and responsibilities to the secondary designed or designated staff to sustain essential functions. Devolution may be temporary or may endure for an extended period, the directive states, and it further directs that the devolution staff be located at a geographically dispersed location unaffected by the incident. Except that in the case of the coronavirus, there may be no such location. This places the plans for the extraordinary into completely uncharted territory. Planners not just considering how devolution or martial law might work in a nationwide disaster, but also how those earmarked to implement these very plans have to be sequestered and made ready, even while they are equally vulnerable. Northcom stresses in almost everything it produces for public consumption that it operates only in support of civil authorities, in response to state requests for assistance or with the consent of local authorities. Legally, the command says the use of federal military forces and law enforcement can only take place if those forces are used to suppress insurrection, domestic violence, unlawful combination, or conspiracy. A second test also has to be met, that such disturbances hinders the execution of laws of that state and the United States within that state. That is, that the public is deprived of its legal and constitutional protections. Local authorities must be unable, fail, or refuse. Think about that. Unable, fail, or refuse to protect the civilian population for military forces to be called in. Pentagon directives make clear. Since Hurricane Katrina in 2006, no emergency has triggered any state to even request federal military aid under these procedures. Part of the reason the senior officer involved in the planning says is that local police forces have themselves become more capable, acquiring military-grade equipment and training, which they have. And part of the reason is that the governors have worked together to strengthen the National Guard, which can enforce domestic law when it is mustered under state control, which we've seen that happen in, 3 states now? It's in 3 states, California, New York, and Chicago, maybe? I know it's in Maryland and whatnot, too. I believe it's in Maryland. Yeah, Baltimore, Maryland, they rolled out. So we're seeing that happen. But to give a sense of how sensitive the employment of military forces on American soil is, when the New York National Guard arrived in New Rochelle last week, even though they were operating under the control of the governor, Mayor Noam Branson, still found it necessary to assure the public that no one in the military uniform would have any policing functions yet. Local authorities around America are already expressing worries that they have insufficient equipment, particularly ventilators, to deal with the possible influx of corona patients. The number of hospital beds fewer than the potential number of patients that could need them, and brawls have already broken out in stores where products are in short supply. Toilet paper. The worst case is the shortages and the violent. The worst case is that shortages and violence spreads. That the federal military, isolated and kept healthy behind its own barricade, is called to take over. Orders have already gone out to Secretary of Defense Esper and his deputy David Norquist to remain physically separated to guard against both of them becoming incapacitated. Other national security agencies are following suit, and the White House continuity specialists are ready in evacuation should the virus sweep through the executive mansion. The plan states that the government continues essential functions under all circumstances, even if that is with the devolved second string or under temporary military command. One of the national essential functions, according to the Federal Continuity Directive 1, is that the government provide leadership visible to the nation and the world while maintaining the trust and confidence of the American people. The question is whether a faceless elite could ever provide that confidence, preserving government command, but also adding to public panic. That panic could also be a virus too. So